Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are standing on a crowded balcony in the heart of Tehran. The year is 1953. The air is not just hot, it is heavy with the smell of old paper, sweet jasmine, and the bitter scent of gasoline. Below you, the streets are a sea of moving bodies. Thousands of men in white shirts are shouting a name you do not yet recognize. This is the sound of a nation trying to find its voice. Now, look across the ocean, thousands of miles away, to a quiet, air-conditioned room in Washington, D.C. There is no shouting here. There is only the soft ticking of a clock and the scratch of a pen on a secret map. Two men are looking at a folder marked with a stamp of high secrecy. They are making a decision that will change the lives of millions of people who they will never meet. They're deciding how to stop a man they have never spoken to. This is the moment everything changed. This is the moment a long and quiet friendship between two distant worlds began to turn into a dark and bitter shadow. For a long time, Americans and Iranians looked at each other with genuine curiosity and respect. They saw each other as partners in a new world. But on this dusty afternoon in August, that reflection in the mirror was shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. Have you ever wondered how two nations can go from being brothers to being bitter rivals for over 70 years? Why does the ghost of 1953 still haunt the hallways of power today? To understand the anger, the sanctions, and the cold silence of the present, we must first understand the warmth of the past. We must see the small decisions that led to the Great Fire. Are you ready to journey with me through the mists of time? Pull your chairs a little closer to our campfire, my friends. The night is quiet, but the story we are about to tell is loud with the echoes of history. Let's go far back to a time before the oil, before the revolution, and before the walls were built between us. Let us travel back to the late 1800s. Imagine a world without airplanes, without radios, and without the internet. Iran was then known to the West as Persia. It was a land of ancient blue-tiled mosques, vast deserts, and poets who wrote about the moon and the stars. At that time, Persia felt trapped between two great lions, the British Empire to the south and the Russian Empire to the north. The Persians were looking for a third force. They wanted a friend who did not want to steal their land or control their kings. They looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw a young, energetic nation called the United States. To the Persians, America seemed like a miracle. It was a country that had fought for its own freedom against an empire. It seemed honest, distant, and filled with people who only wanted to trade and teach. In those early days, the first Americans to arrive in Persia did not carry guns or secret documents. They carried black medical bags and heavy boxes of textbooks. They were teachers and doctors. One of them was a young man named Howard Baskerville. He was a teacher from Nebraska who went to the city of Tabriz to teach English and history. He did not know that he would never see his home again. In 1909, Howard saw his students fighting for a constitution and a fair government. He saw them starving and dying in the streets. He made a difficult decision. He told his consulate, "The only difference between me and these people is my place of birth, and that is not a big difference." He put down his books and picked up a rifle to help his students. When he was killed in the fighting, the people of Tabriz buried him as a hero. For many years, Howard Baskerville was the face of America in Iran. He represented a country that was willing to bleed for the freedom of others. American advisors like Morgan Schuster were also hired to help organize the Persian economy. Schuster was a tall man with a sharp mind who truly cared about making Persia strong. But every time an American tried to help Persia become independent, the old empires of Europe stepped in to stop them. The friendship was built on this shared feeling of being an underdog. Iranians saw Americans as the good Westerners. They invited American engineers to build their first railroads and American doctors to start their first modern hospitals. There was a genuine sense of hope. But as the years passed, a thick black liquid began to bubble up from the southern deserts. This black gold would soon turn the sweet dream of friendship into a bitter struggle for power. Imagine a world of shadows and whispers. It is the early 1950s, and the smell of oil is everywhere. It is a thick, heavy scent that fills the air near the Persian Gulf. For decades, a foreign company had controlled this black gold. The Iranian people watched as their natural wealth was pumped out of the ground and sent away to fuel the empires of the West. They felt like guests in their own home, receiving only a small fraction of the profits. This sense of injustice began to grow like a storm cloud over the mountains of Tehran. In the center of this storm stood a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a tall, elderly statesman with a sharp mind and a heart full of fire. He did not wear royal robes. He often wore simple clothes and spoke with a voice that trembled with emotion. He had a dream that was both simple and bold. Iran's oil should belong to Iran's people. In 1951, he led the movement to nationalize the oil industry. He walked through the halls of parliament with a firm step, believing that the law and the spirit of independence were on his side. Across the ocean, the reaction was cold and swift. The British were furious. They saw the oil as theirs. They looked for help from their American friends. At first, the United States was hesitant. President Truman liked Mossadegh and saw him as a patriot. But then the political weather changed. A new administration took office in Washington, and the fear of the Cold War began to color every decision. The Americans were told that if they did not act, the Soviet Union might step in. The good Westerners began to listen to the whispers of spies. A secret plan was born. It was called Operation Ajax. Imagine a quiet office in Washington where men with cigars stared at maps of Tehran. They did not see people. They saw chess pieces. They sent a secret agent named Kermit Roosevelt to Iran with a suitcase full of money and a mission to start a coup. This was the moment the relationship broke. The United States, once seen as a protector of freedom, was now acting like the old empires. The CIA began to pay people to protest, to spread lies, and to create chaos in the streets. In August 1953, the pressure reached a breaking point. The sounds of tanks echoed through the narrow alleys of the capital. Soldiers stood at every corner. Mossadegh was arrested in his home, his dream of a free oil industry shattered. The young Shah, who had fled the country in fear, was brought back to his throne by foreign hands. He sat in his palace, but he knew his power came from Washington, not from his own people. This was the first failure of trust, a deep, invisible wound that would never truly heal. The Iranian people felt a profound sense of rejection. They had looked to America as a model of democracy, but now they saw a different face. They saw a nation that was willing to destroy a democracy to protect a profit. The silence that followed the coup was heavy and filled with doubt. The Shah began to build a massive police force to keep his people quiet, and he did so with American money and training. The atmosphere was no longer safe and reflective. It was filled with the fear of the shadow. Every 30 seconds, the tension grew. People whispered in tea houses about the lost leader. They looked at the American cars on the streets and saw symbols of control rather than progress. The white gold was flowing again, but the price was the soul of a partnership. The United States thought they had won a victory against communism, but they had actually planted the seeds of a future fire. They had traded a friend for an ally, and an ally's much easier to lose. As the years passed, the Shah's palace grew more magnificent, but the distance between him and his people grew wider. He was a modernizer who forgot to bring his people's hearts along with his reforms. He relied on the American military to stay strong, and the Americans relied on him to keep the oil moving. It was a cycle of dependency that ignored the quiet anger growing in the villages and the mosques. The tragedy of 1953 was not just about oil. It was about the loss of an ideal. It was the moment the campfire of friendship went out, and the shadows of the night took over. By the late 1970s, the atmosphere in Iran felt like a dry forest waiting for a single spark. The Shah lived in a world of gold and mirrors, celebrating 2,000 years of monarchy with expensive parties that cost millions. But outside the palace walls, the air was cold and filled with a different energy. Many Iranians felt that their culture was being drowned by Western movies, music, and ideas that did not fit their traditions. They looked at the American helicopters flying over their cities and did not see progress. They saw a king who cared more about Washington than his own people. In the winter of 1979, the spark finally arrived. A man with a white beard and a black robe, Ayatollah Khomeini, spoke from his exile in France. His voice was carried into Iran on small plastic cassette tapes, passed from hand to hand in the shadows of the mosques. He spoke of dignity, of religion, and of standing up to the great Satan, the name he gave to the United States. The pressure inside the nation exploded. Millions of people poured into the streets of Tehran, their voices rising like a physical wall of sound. The Shah, the man the Americans had spent decades protecting, looked out from his balcony one last time and saw that he was truly alone. The Shah fled the country in January, his airplane disappearing into the gray clouds. But the drama was only beginning. In October, the United States allowed the former Shah to enter an American hospital for cancer treatment. To the young revolutionaries in Tehran, this was not a medical act, it was a conspiracy. They feared the Americans were planning another coup, just like they had in 1953. On a rainy Sunday morning, November 4th, hundreds of students gathered outside the gray stone walls of the American embassy. They carried heavy metal cutters and a deep sense of anger. The students climbed over the gates, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the compound. Inside, American diplomats frantically shredded secret papers, the white strips of paper falling like snow on the office floors. 52 Americans were taken captive, their eyes covered with blindfolds. This was the lowest emotional moment for both nations. For the Americans watching at home, it was a nightmare that would not end. Every night for 444 days, the news showed images of the hostages, creating a wound in the American psyche that has never truly closed. The embassy, once a place of diplomacy, became a den of spies in the eyes of the new Iranian government. The two nations were now locked in a dark room, shouting at each other but unable to see a way out. President Carter tried a daring rescue mission with helicopters in the desert, but it ended in a tragic crash in the sand. This failure made the United States feel weak, and it made the Iranian revolutionaries feel invincible. The friendship of the past was not just broken, it was buried under the weight of 444 days of silence and suspicion. As the hostages were finally released in January 1981, they flew away from Tehran, but they left behind a world that was forever changed. The diplomatic maps were redrawn. The United States and Iran cut all ties, ending a century of partnership in a single cold stroke. The good Westerners and the heroic Persians were now gone, replaced by two enemies who would spend the next 40 years looking for ways to hurt each other. The winter of 1979 was the turning point where the fire of revolution burned the bridge between East and West. Imagine a long, dark corridor where every door is locked and the lights have been turned out. This was the state of the world for these two former friends as the 1980s began. The decision to continue down a path of silence was not just a political choice, it became a way of life. The United States and Iran were no longer speaking, but they were still very much involved in each other's lives, often in the most painful ways possible. In 1980, a new shadow fell over the region. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, launched a massive invasion of Iran. The sound of falling bombs and the sight of chemical clouds filled the air. For 8 long years, Iran fought a desperate war for its survival. During this time, the United States made a strategic decision that would haunt the relationship for decades. They began to provide intelligence and support to Iraq. To the people in Washington, this was a way to balance power. To the people in Tehran, it was proof that America wanted their nation to disappear. Yet, even in this era of deep hatred, there was a strange and secret turning point. In the mid-1980s, high-ranking officials from the Reagan administration traveled to Tehran on a secret mission. They did not come with flowers. They came with a cake, a Bible, and a plan to sell weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. This Iran-Contra affair showed that behind the shouting and the public anger, both sides were still willing to talk if the price was right. It was a moment of deep hypocrisy that confused the public in both countries. The war finally ended in 1988, leaving behind 1 million dead and a landscape of broken dreams. But the tension did not fade with the smoke of the battlefield. Just as the war was ending, an American warship in the Persian Gulf accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airplane, Flight 655. 290 innocent people fell from the sky into the blue water. The United States called it a tragic accident of war. Iran called it a deliberate crime. This event solidified the image of America as a heartless giant in the minds of a new generation of Iranians. Following these tragedies, a new leadership began to emerge in Iran. Some leaders started to wonder if the path of total isolation was sustainable. They saw a world that was moving forward, while their own country was held back by the chains of sanctions and war. They began to ask a dangerous question. Is it possible to be a revolutionary and still talk to your enemy? This was the beginning of a long and slow internal debate. The turning point was not a single day, but a gradual realization that the wall of ice between the two nations was hurting the ordinary people the most. Every 2 or 3 years, a small signal would be sent. A diplomat would make a cautious speech. A sports team would travel to the other country for a wrestling match. These were like small cracks at a frozen lake. But every time the ice began to melt, a new crisis would freeze it over again. Whether it was the struggle over influence in the Middle East or the rising fear of a new kind of weapon, the two nations remained trapped in a cycle of suspicion. They were like two boxers in a ring, too tired to keep fighting but too proud to drop their gloves. The real decision to continue was made by the millions of ordinary people on both sides. In America, Iranian immigrants became doctors, engineers, and teachers, building a human bridge that the politicians could not destroy. In Iran, young people continued to learn English and watch American films in secret, keeping a window open to a world they were told to hate. They were waiting for a leader brave enough to walk through the door and sit by the fire once more. The turning point was the realization that while the governments were enemies, the cultures were still deeply curious about each other. The years that followed the Great War were defined by a different kind of combat. It was a long struggle of discipline, patience, and the slow, grinding machinery of international politics. As the world moved into a new millennium, the silence between Washington and Tehran was no longer just a break in friendship. It had become a dangerous void. In this void, a new shadow began to grow, the shadow of the atom. The Iranian government began to invest heavily in nuclear technology, claiming it was for energy and medicine. But to the rest of the world, especially the United States, it looked like a quest for the ultimate weapon. Imagine the discipline required for a nation living under the heavy weight of global sanctions. For decades, the Iranian economy was like a runner trying to move with heavy lead weights tied to their ankles. Every paragraph of this era is written with the struggle of ordinary people. In the quiet streets of Isfahan and the busy markets of Tehran, the price of bread and medicine rose higher every year. Yet, the Iranian leadership refused to blink. They saw their nuclear program as a symbol of national pride and scientific achievement. They remembered the coup of 1953 and the war of the 1980s, and they decided they would never be weak again. During these years, the struggle was not just about technology. It was about the shadow within the human soul, much like the ideas of Carl Jung. Both nations had created a persona or a social mask for the other. To many Americans, Iran was a land of radical slogans and hidden threats. To many Iranians, America was an imperial giant that only understood the language of force. Neither side wanted to look at their own mistakes. They preferred to point at the darkness in the other while ignoring the darkness in themselves. This psychological wall was often taller and thicker than any physical border. Every 30 to 45 seconds in this history, a new obstacle appeared. There were secret laboratories buried deep under mountains. There were computer viruses that acted like invisible soldiers, breaking machinery without firing a single bullet. There were scientists who disappeared in the middle of the day. The struggle was quiet, constant, and exhausting. It was a period of slow progress, where for every step forward, the two nations seemed to take 2 steps back into the cold. The world watched with a sense of existential crisis, wondering if a single mistake would lead to a final, devastating explosion. Yet, even in the middle of this long struggle, the human spirit remained unbroken. In the universities of California and the research centers of Tehran, students continued to study the same physics and the same poetry. They were connected by an invisible river of knowledge that ignored the sanctions and the threats. This was the discipline of the ordinary person. The refusal to hate someone just because a government told them to. They waited through the decades of cold silence, hoping for a moment when the liquid stone of history would finally become soft enough to reshape. The struggle taught both nations a hard lesson about the limits of power. America learned that sanctions alone could not change a nation's soul. Iran learned that pride alone could not feed a hungry population. They were like two wrestlers who had been locked in the hold for so long that they had forgotten why the match had started. They were tired, they were bruised, but they were still waiting for a turning point, a decision to finally try a different way. The long struggle was the fire that tested their resilience, preparing them for a breakthrough that no one thought was possible. In the year 2013, a small and unexpected window of opportunity began to open. After decades of cold silence, a new president was elected in Iran who spoke of constructive engagement with the world. Across the ocean, the American leadership was also looking for a way to prevent a new war in the Middle East. The two nations began to do something they had not done in a generation. They began to talk directly. It started with a secret phone call, a moment of recognition that echoed around the globe. The struggle then moved to quiet, elegant hotels in cities like Vienna and Geneva. Imagine the scene. Diplomats from both sides sitting across long wooden tables, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the weight of history. For days and nights that turned into weeks, they argued over every single word and every technical detail. They were trying to build a bridge out of paper and ink, a graded reader for a new kind of peace. This was the public attention they had both feared and desired for 40 years. Every 30 to 45 seconds during these negotiations, the deal almost fell apart. Old ghosts from 1953 and 1979 would enter the room, whispering doubts into the ears of the negotiators. One side would ask for a reveal of secret facilities. The other would demand a decision to end the heavy sanctions. There were moments of high emotional tension where leaders almost walked out, tired of the slow progress and the weight of the shadow. But the desire for a breakthrough was stronger than the habit of hatred. In July 2015, the world watched a historic snapshot. The foreign ministers of Iran and the United States stood side by side in a grand hall, smiling for the cameras. They had signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a document that promised to limit Iran's nuclear spirit in exchange for a return to the global family. It was a cinematic moment of hope, a liquid stone that seemed to have finally set into a solid foundation. People in Tehran danced in the streets, holding up their phones to capture the light of a new day. However, as we have learned in this long story, breakthroughs are often as fragile as glass. A few years later, the political winds in Washington changed once again. The United States made a sudden decision to leave the agreement, placing the heavy chains of sanctions back onto the Iranian economy. The window that had opened with such effort was slammed shut, leaving both nations back in the familiar darkness of uncertainty. The recognition they had achieved seemed to vanish like smoke from a dying fire. This setback was a reminder that the struggle for peace is not a straight line. It is a long journey with many turning points, some that lead forward and some that lead back into the past. The breakthrough of 2015 showed that diplomacy is possible, even between the bitterest of rivals. It proved that if the wise, warm storyteller of history is given a chance, even the deepest wounds can begin to be discussed. But it also taught us that a single decision can undo years of discipline and practice. Now, the two nations stand at another crossroads, watching each other with a mixture of fatigue and suspicion. They are waiting for a new hint of what happens next, a small mystery that might lead them back to the table. The breakthrough was not the end of the story. It was a discovery of what is possible when we choose to look past the shadow and see the human being. On the other side, the lesson of these years is that while trust is slow to build, the human spirit's desire for connection is an unbreakable force. As the night grows deep and the fire begins to turn into glowing red coals, we must ask ourselves, what is the meaning of this century-long journey? We have traveled from the early days of teachers and doctors to the high-stakes world of nuclear physics and secret coups. We have seen how a single decision in a quiet room can spark a fire that burns for 70 years. It is a story that teaches us about the fragile nature of friendship and the heavy weight of the shadow that lives within all nations. The history of Iran and the United States is not just a list of dates or a collection of political speeches. It is a reflection of the unbreakable human spirit and the way we are all connected across time and borders. We see that even when governments build walls and stop speaking, the people continue to reach out. They share poems, they share science, and they share a quiet hope for a world where they no longer have to be enemies. This resilience is the true white gold of the human experience. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that time is an invisible river. It carries the mistakes of the past, but it also provides the water to grow something new. To heal, we must first have the courage to look at the dark truth of our shared history without blinking. We must move past the simple labels of hero and villain to see the complex, emotional human beings underneath the masks of power. Only then can the liquid stone of our old hatreds be reshaped into a foundation for something better. My friends, as you prepare to return to your own lives, remember that history is still being written by your own curiosity and your own empathy. Every time you choose to learn a new language or read a story from a distant land, you are building a bridge. You are choosing to sit by the fire instead of hiding in the dark. The journey between these two lands is not finished. It is simply waiting for a new generation to find a way to walk together in peace. Thank you for sitting with me by the fire today and listening to this epic saga of human struggle and connection. Your journey through these words is a testament to your own resilience and your desire for understanding. I hope this story has helped your English practice and, more importantly, touched your heart. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and keep dreaming. This script is based on real historical research using sources from the U.S., State Department Archives, the National Security Archive, and academic works by historians like Ervand Abrahamian and Nikki Ketty. Some dialogue and emotional details have been reconstructed based on survivor accounts and academic research. The purpose of this video is not to glorify war, but to honor human sacrifice and courage on all sides.